You have arrived at the correct panel. You've created a monster. This panel is something that is near and dear to many of our hearts. You've seen the description. You've seen the work of the amazing people here. I am joined today with luminaries in their field. We are with Melanie Anderson, Andy Davidson, Stephen Graham Jones, and Lisa Kroger. What I would like to do, first off, folks, if we could do a bit of a round table. One of the first questions that a lot of folks get when we're talking about writing things that are categorized as horror by publishers is, what makes it horror? What is when someone asks you what you write and you say, I write horror stories, what defines that genre to you? Let's start with you, Stephen.
You can hear me now, right?
Yes,
right.
You sound wonderful.
You know what horror is to me, whether I'm writing it or reading it, really is that which disturbs, that which leaves things different than they were, I guess. Which, to tell you the truth, that's kind of the definition of all art, ideally. But I think horror, in particular, disturbs your sleep. It disturbs the way you walk through a parking garage at 2 a.m. It disturbs the way you look at your neighbor, and that's what I'm looking for when I read horror. I want to engage something that's gonna change me and maybe help me too.
And first off, I love that one. To be clear, this is also an organic conversation. So folks, you're going to hear our panelists. Hopefully, if I'm doing my job right, you're going to hear our panelists be in conversation with one another. Melanie, let's go to you. What defines horror for you? Would you agree with that definition? Anything to add? Anything to throw out?
I'm not going to throw out anything that Stephen said, but maybe I could add to it a little bit. I guess I come to this from a slightly different point of view. I'm an academic, and so I write about horror. And so I'm reading all these people's stuff and then commenting on it. But horror for me, I think, encompasses everything that Stephen just said. It's supposed to disturb you. It's supposed to make you feel that there's weird possibilities in the world. I particularly enjoy Shirley Jackson's writing, and I think she does that extremely well. One thing, when Lisa and I were writing Monster, She Wrote, and when we do the podcast, we like to think about how people have these kind of stereotyped visions of horror as being like one thing or one genre or type of horror. And for me, I grew up not thinking I was a horror fan, even though I love supernatural, creepy things, because I had this idea that it was like a slasher movie or something. And it was when I got to graduate school and people were like, oh, you could write about supernatural things. And I was like, seriously? So then I started doing that. And I kind of realized that there's like this whole tradition of just, creepy, disturbing, pushing the boundaries of what we think of as real. But also, I think there's a lot of horror in real life that people translate into supernatural stories. I think that's where our ideas of monsters come from. And that's where our ideas of ghosts come from, is just the horrific things that we see in real life. And then you read a horror book or horror fiction and you can translate that into a supernatural way, but the reader is going to realize what it is that you're actually talking about, or those larger kind of real life themes that are being translated.
And I love that you mentioned Monster, She Wrote, which is the winner of the 2019 Bram Stoker Award. Yes, co-written with Lisa Kroger. In your process here, let's explore this a bit. In you all's process, Melanie, Lisa, did you find anything that, I guess, surprised you about the role of female identifying authors in the world of One thing I really appreciate is the fact that you all chose the subtitle speculative fiction rather than horror. Could you all talk a little bit about that choice, and could you all talk a little bit about the things that surprised you in the course of creating this work?
I was really hoping Melanie would pick that one up.
Oh, sorry.
I know.
I
I threw a lot at everybody, and I'm staring at Andy's awesome Swamp Thing comic and his background. We got a lot going on. But yeah, why speculative fiction
All right,
specifically?
I'll start with the speculative fiction. Yeah, that was one that we really like that term speculative fiction, but I think we were also being intentional because a lot of people, when they hear the word horror, like in and of itself, that's a very aggressive word in the literary world. I think just in my own writing, I've had problems selling things if I've labeled it as horror. But then if I've labeled the same story as something like dark thriller or speculative fiction, or even just like a dark literary story, whatever, that people respond to it better. And so one of the things we wanted to do with Monster She Wrote is kind of prove to people that horror is for everybody, and most people like it, whether they want to admit it or not. So what Mel left out is that we've known each other for a very long time, and I was the person who was constantly in her ear pushing her to say that she liked horror and to read it. I like that, because speculative fiction, I think when you look at that word, it makes us look at the world differently. And that kind of goes back to what Stephen was talking about earlier, is that's one of the main functions, I think, of literature, is to make you, not only to make you feel something, but to make you view your world a little bit differently. And so I don't know, that was very rambling, but.
Oh,
yeah,
this is,
and
Stephen, please.
In order to sell The Only Good Indians, my novel, The Only Good Indians, I had to market it as wildlife NBA, I couldn't call it horror.
Is that true? That's a bit of a peek behind the curtain.
Yeah.
Wow.
No, but she's right about, I think speculative fiction, or what we used to call slipstream back in the 90s, it's just all the fantastic genres, which is wonderful and great. But the power I see in it is that like I can tell a story about my dad and I sitting on the couch on a Sunday afternoon watching basketball, and my uncle gets drunk, comes down, kicks our door down, fights my dad, they break the whole living room and everything goes terrible. And that's going to be like a sad bummer story, it's going to be like, oh, look at my woeful childhood. But if I tell a story about my dad and I watching basketball in the living room on a Sunday, and a zombie shambles through the door and my dad has to fight that zombie, I think I can get the same feelings on the page in about half the space and in an entertaining manner, So for me, that's what like a build like horror can provide. It can compress things and let you get to the heart of the matter a lot quicker than if you have to slowly build everything, if that makes sense.
It does. Yeah, it does. And let's Stephen, let's bring Andy into the conversation here. Now, Andy, you also have been, we have no chumps in the squad here. Everybody here is an amazing author, and I especially would like to shout out In the Valley of the Sun. When you are working from stem to stern, right? People end up seeing, other than our close friends, our publishers and our editors that we fight with for years. The audience, the readers, they see a finished product. What inspires you, Andy, when you are, as Stephen said, when you're walking and it's 2 a.m. in the parking lot, right? Is it a moment that inspires you? Is it a thought? Is it a smell, an experience? Where do these horrible things arise?
In innocuous places, maybe. like to go within the valley of the sun. I've told this story a few times, but the inspiration for that book came when I was painting a fence in my backyard, and I was listening on my earbuds to Dwight Yoakam's cover of Honky Tonk Man. And that song is a song I've heard all my life, but for some reason that day out in the sunshine, it struck me as really sinister. This idea of I'm a honky tonk man and I can't seem to stop. So there's this compulsive behavior that this guy is engaging in. And I just kind of followed that train of thought to like, where does that go? But I like what Steven said about the idea of the zombie shambling into the room, because I think one of the things that for me horror is a way to see ourselves reflected in monsters. They monsters show us ourselves, and so that to me is always a place that I go to, is like when I'm writing horror, when I'm working on a story, what is this story going to show me about people? Because I think that's one of the neat things about horror. When you read some genres, you're just sort of caught up in the entertainment of it, or you're propelled along by a propulsive story, and that's all wonderful stuff, and we should be trying for that as horror writers, definitely, I think. But also there's another element or a layer to horror that is our innermost selves and the darkness that we all carry around in us as people. I mean, most of us try to be good people, but we fail sometimes, or we know people who fail in ways much worse and more egregious than we do. And so I think horror is a way to see that without, in a safe way. I read Stephen's New York Times op-ed that just published yesterday, and he talks about the idea that there is an end to horror stories, and I really like that, Stephen. That these narratives show us the bad stuff, but they also remind us of what we can be, of the best parts of ourselves in addition to the worst parts. So that's always key to me with writing horror.
Well said, Andy. This is also there's an idea here then of horror as exploration, horror as encounter with the self, horror as, in a way, commentary upon ourselves. So with that, let's turn back to Melanie specifically. Melanie, we're talking now in terms of commentary of what horror says, or what the inspiration is, and to Andy's excellent point, and the idea of confronting, as you said earlier, some things that are, I don't know, is horror always metaphor? Because you have read so widely. Are there common trends that you see, or is there something that you could say is common inspiration for many horror writers?
Oh man, I don't know what I could say is a common inspiration other than just their fears. I mean, I think anybody who is reading horror is kind of testing, I guess, fears in maybe a safe way. Like, Andy was saying that there's an end to it. And I wonder if writers maybe approach horror in the same way. I definitely think there's a double feel to it too, that the monster can be your fear, but the monster can also be yourself. Yeah, I'm trying to think of like common things. I think it depends on the culture. I think it depends on the historical moment and the individual. I mean, like, over the summer for the No Fear podcast that I'm on, we did kaiju movies. And when you think of kaiju movies, you think of like, oh, just big monsters destroying cities and that's it. Hey, nice. And we just got in these really fascinating discussions about what Godzilla represented and how what he represented changed throughout all the movies that were made. And then we talked about, things like the South Korean movie, The Host, and how complicated that was. And I feel like there are these tropes in horror like ghosts or the monster or, you know, zombies, whatever, and they come back and forth in favor and in popularity based on what people are maybe afraid of at the time. Whether they're, you know, representing atomic war because that's what people just experienced, or they're representing a pandemic because that's what we all just experienced, or they're representing isolation because that's what we all just experienced. And yeah, I don't know if there are common tropes other than that history repeats itself and then we all have to react to it in some way, if that makes sense. And then I think in some ways we kind of find ourselves working through this stuff by reading it. Like I could read a short story that has something horrifying in it and be like, ooh, that was scary and I can't sleep now, that was enjoyable. And someone else could read it and see something really powerful in it about themselves, or, you know, something that may have inspired that story. So I think it's kind of like all literature. It's mirror that we hold up to ourselves, and it can be entertaining, but it also can have all these underlying levels too.
Melanie, what an awesome answer to such a like terrible question of like, just explain everything, go. Yeah, go. That's what always happens with this stuff, right? That I think that is a fantastic answer. It reminds me when you're talking a little bit about the cyclical nature of these things, right? Some publisher has some, like their kid saw you know, Squid Game or something, and they're like, you know, what's really hot right now is Squid Game. But that's sort of indicative of these cycles. What triggers a zeitgeist of fear, and in what way does the old, you know, creature from the Black Lagoon or the Mummy or whatever, those stereotypical archetypes of Hollywood horror, they seem to come up again and again. But what I love about this panel, and what I love about our panelists here, is the depth of knowledge and the you know, Stephen, you've been described as working in experimental fiction sometimes instead of horror. And in The Bird Is Gone and in The Long Trial of Nolan Dugatti, you did some things that may not be like to a just like straight-laced publisher. Imagine I have a tie on, you know, they would say, is this horror? And what this is a question for everyone. What is your pet peeve, either with publishing or with writers? Like when you're reading a horror story, or when you're thinking of a horror story, what is something that you would sincerely ask budding writers not to do?
You know what I see, am I unmuted? Yeah, I'm unmuted. What I see a lot, I work with a lot of beginning writers, and it in a horror story, it's really easy to come up with a meat grinder of a narrative that chews everybody up, which means at the end of the story, everybody's dead on the floor, you know. And I think that's, I mean, I'm not saying everyone gets to live. That's not a horror story either. But I think in horror, my pet peeve is when it's so grim that everybody just dies and it's over, and I'm left like, I feel incomplete, you know. I do want that hope at the end. I want to feel, I don't know, I want my emotional and intellectual investment to pay off at the end with some sort of up ramp a little bit. I don't need like a Star Wars award ceremony or anything, you know, but just to have one person walk out and see the sunlight, you know, and if that person's not a vampire, then that's good news, you know.
This is, by the way, this is my version of throwing the golden apple that says to the fairest. I do want everyone to feel free to interject and to disagree, or to hype each other up, because the written word, the stories we tell, they only exist because someone exists to read them as well. I believe that is a valid argument. Lisa, we haven't heard from you in a second. You and Melanie, you have a depth of research. You have an amazing book. Do you have pet peeves? Do you have pet peeves personally when you're reading a horror story? Is there anything that makes you think, oh my God,
I mean, there's a lot. This goes along with what Stephen was saying with the hope because day about wanting the blue skies at the end of the horror story. Like we just need a little bit of, I personally like horror when it's fun at times, because I think that that's something that I like to keep in mind. Like when I'm reading something or writing something that, the reason we're all horror fans is because we take some sort of like dark delight in it. And sometimes I think people can get too focused on making it so dark and bleak, especially if they're focused on making it a metaphor for something. Like it's always going to be a metaphor, but I think if you get too focused on that, it can get really heavy really fast. And I like to have a little bit of a fun house in the horror that I read, just a little bit of that. Also, and this is just a personal pet peeve, I feel like I'm throwing a bomb in the conversation saying this, but I would love it if we stopped using the word elevated at all to describe horror, because I cringe a little bit inside every time I hear that.
Yeah. I mean, I do like the word elevated when it's referring to elevators. That's
a useful thing. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting too, because that term sometimes comes from outside of the community. And I like that we're talking about specifics, and it's it's a brilliant coincidence that all of us seem to be on the same page. I've been in panels wherein academics and various very passionate, very talented people disagree wholeheartedly, like in a way you would want to write about later. With this though, it seems like our pet peeves are kind of coinciding. We're kind of agreeing on the idea of what motivates us. We're kind of agreeing on the ideas that we don't like, unless that is Andy. Pet peeves. I didn't know if you were, because this is again the golden apple to the fairest. So where are we at? Pet peeves.
These are three of my favorite people in the world. So like that's not going to happen probably. In terms of pet peeves within the genre and writing itself, I don't know if I have any. I'm pretty open, but I agree with Stephen. I agree with Lisa. I don't like horror being like treated like a second-class citizen, and I don't like horror writers being treated that way either. When I did a book club event for my first novel in a small town here in Georgia years ago, and there were a steady stream of people coming in for it. It was a very nice group. But there was one sweet, dear, elderly lady who shook my hand. And when I introduced myself to her, she said, "Oh, you're the one with the diseased mind," uh, which I found out in the course of the conversation. And if any, Lisa and Mel have known me much longer than Stephen. Stephen knows me a little bit, but I don't have a diseased mind, I promise. But what I found out in the course of the book event was when she got to page 90 in the Valley of the Sun, she stopped reading. And so later after the event, I went and looked up what was on page 90. And it turns out that's the page where, a baby gets eaten. And I thought, well, okay, I'll give you that. That's rough if that's not your thing. But
if that's not your thing.
Yeah. If I don't like for horror writers to be treated as if they are somehow low-minded or less invested in the art they're creating than someone who is a loftier, literary, elevated writer, as Lisa said. So that's a real pet peeve of mine, is because I find that horror writers are not only not demented people, but they're the nicest people on the planet. So I'm very proud to be a part of the horror writing community, and that's That's something.
Yeah,
I'm very happy.
like Stephen King says, like horror writers are really well balanced because we give all our nightmares away, and yeah, hanging around with the horror community, that's what I've found. It's really amazing. I should qualify my what I call my pet peeve about everybody being dead at the end, because with horror at the end of stories or novels or movies, there's like two types of happy endings. There's the happy ending where the final girl kills Jason Voorhees. There's also the final ending where Jason Voorhees wins, and we, the horror audience, are happy because that means the horror is going to continue. But sometimes when the monster wins, like when Godzilla thoroughly stomps the city or whatever it is, we do cheer a little bit, and it's not because we're evil or sick or twisted. It's just because Godzilla deserves to stomp that city. I don't know. I mean, I think horror is the only genre that has like the happy ending can go two ways and be happy either way.
Yeah, I think that's right. I agree with all your pet peeves. I don't really have anything to add. We're very much in agreement today here. But yeah, I do. When I watch Godzilla movies, I feel sympathy for him. I mean, these people polluted his water and made him get up and have no place to be. But then at the same time, he's also an evil monster. And you think of like a traditional monster like Frankenstein's monster. He does bad things, but there's a sympathy for him. And I think there is this kind of double in the way we look at monsters, that they can do bad things or be mean or be evil, but maybe it's not as cut and dry as that in some respects.
And this is, I mean, that's a wonderful point, Melanie. We have, I think we as readers and as authors often run into this, a really beautiful story makes you question the nature of the hero or the villain, right? It doesn't become cut and dry. So what I would ask then is how do you all consider the way of exploring, you'd call it villainy or antagonism or whatever, like in your research and your personal experiences, Melanie, Andy, Lisa, when you think of villain, what does villain mean in your stories or for your characters? What is the level of sympathy? Like I get the sense that none of us think just straight up sort of, doofy, I'm bad because I'm bad. Villains are especially interesting. So what is the key piece of a good villain?
Well, for me, it's always that they don't know they're the villain. They have something they want, and what they want is entirely justified, and their actions in their mind, at least, are justified to achieve that thing. Whether it's, I think about villains like, if you go back to Stephen King's It, there's not a lot of sympathy we have for Pennywise the clown, but from Pennywise's perspective, I'm sure he's just hungry and needs to eat, and he does what he does. And I think there's other characters within that, like Henry Bowers, who weirdly are sympathetic, that we can feel for by the end of their sort of tortured, horrible lives. And so I think that's a really key thing for me, is the villain doesn't know he or she or they are a villain. And I think we as the reader, I think as the writer, we are responsible for making a villain, however monstrous, somewhat empathetic for the reader, or at least the reader can be immersed in that villain's perspective and see where the villain's coming from, which can be really tricky to do. And but that's my take on it.
Well, let's hear from Lisa. Let's hear from Melanie, like your ideas in terms of villains.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with Andy. I will say sometimes you don't need to know too much about the villain to make it a good story. I always think about one of my favorite movies is Black Christmas, and you know nothing about the killer at all. I mean, you do see, interestingly, you do in that film, you do get some camera shots from the point of view of the killer. And I think that adds to it because it feels, at least to me, like there's some compulsion that's making the killer do what he's doing. But I don't think you always have to know the motivations of the killer for it to be a really good story, or the monster. But I also really love it when you see somebody turning monstrous over the course of a story, either through like wants and desires that they have, or because somebody has put that upon them. Like I'm thinking of some of my favorite ones, like Ginger Snaps or like Jennifer's Body or something like that, where you kind of see this transformation into something monstrous happening in front of your eyes. And that's usually because people are acting in a way that society doesn't want them to act. So it kind of goes back to that whole, the monster is the mirror of what we fear. I mean, this is something I'm working through as I'm talking, so it may not be super coherent, but I like that. I like it when you kind of see the transformation of the monster happening right in front of your eyes. Like it's not something that happened before the story. I think that lends a lot of sympathy to the character that you're seeing. It doesn't make what they're doing any less monstrous, though, I think.
And it goes, this seems to go back toward the idea that, like you were saying earlier, Andy, no one wakes up and says, I'm the bad guy today. You know, no one wakes up and thinks, I'm gonna ruin stuff. I'm just gonna be terrible because that's my thing now. There is this sympathy, this unclear demarcation, right? Everyone is their own protagonist, and that's something we have to remember when we think in terms of villains. Like if I recall the excellent example of Pennywise the Clown, I believe, spoiler alert for anyone who is not aware, let's give the audience a second, folks. 3, 2, 1. Pennywise, as it's called by the human characters, is ultimately a creature beyond imagining, something kind of like Lovecraftian, from the darkness between the stars. It's deadlights that are unseeable, really, by mortals. And its whole thing is that it has to feed to reproduce, ultimately, right? And it's best represented as a spider. There's some dark stuff that goes in, but I love the idea because you're right. Henry Bowers is a kid from a broken home who is taken advantage of, as so many children from broken homes are. And Pennywise, from its own mind, is just trying to like have and take care of its kids. You know, it's very strange in that regard. And it makes me wonder about the value of the mystery, because so much of the scary stuff, the really good stuff that we talk about when we're talking about frightening people or frightening ourselves, we're talking about not only the disturbing, as Stephen said earlier, we're talking about the unknown. And I love your point, Lisa, about not knowing everything about a villain, about a motivation. What is the approach you all take when you're thinking like, how do I make it clear that this is a villain, right? Or like Andy, as you said, when we get to page 90 or so, and there is a child consumed, how do we walk the line of explaining, world building? Do you all err on the side of mystery?
Well, in that example, the person that eats the child is the antagonist of the book, the vampire, Rue. But Rue, when I heard from readers about that book in particular, there was a lot of like, we love this character. This is one of our favorite characters in the book. And I think that's partly because you can do horrible things and still be sympathetic. I mean, that's the mirror. We all do horrible things, whether people know it or not. And we're sympathetic to other people who do horrible things. But I was thinking about when Lisa was talking about the idea that we see the transformation, but also we don't know the source necessarily of where this evil is in a character. I always think about Patrick Bateman in American Psycho. The film and the book. The book is what a thing that is, but the book is more difficult than the film in many ways for me, because the book is, I mean, you have no escape from Patrick Bateman's head. But there is a charm and a humor and a compulsion to watch this character unravel and go insane. But you also get the sense at the very beginning of the story that he's always been insane, that he's not becoming a monster, he simply is a monster. And of course, that film and that book are kind of critiques about society and kind of, you could even say, satire in some ways. But yeah, I don't know. This is my rambling answer, and I think, like, I've almost forgotten your question, Ben.
It's okay. It was a rambling question, Andy. I was just sort of TED talking.
Yeah, no. But yeah. So anyway, I'm just sort of like seconding what Lisa said, especially about ginger snaps. That's a great example of, like, by the end of that film, you desperately don't want this horrible thing to happen to either of these girls, and it's going to, and it's really hard. It's a great movie.
So there's a transformation, almost. It seems like we're saying we're seeing something that may not be explicitly depicted, but is something that hopefully the audience can encounter. Like, I have to refer back to Melanie earlier. I believe you mentioned, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you mentioned Shirley Jackson, one of the, I would say one of the best horror writers working in this current alphabet. In terms of horror there, or speculative fiction, or weird fiction, what was your experience with the way this author approached what Andy and Lisa are talking about, the idea of transformation, the idea of villains or heroes or antagonist or protagonist?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure that Shirley Jackson really has like cut and dry, black and white, like this person is a villain or this person isn't. She does have stories where, people are stalked by like random people, and it's never explained like why that person has chosen them or that sort of thing. Her stories that deal with paranoia and just the idea of fear itself. What I like about her is just how she takes things that should seem normal to us and shows us how uncanny and weird they can be. Like her stories about her children, which were supposed to be these like pleasant domestic sketches of family life. And if you read them really carefully, they can be very creepy. The things that her children says and the way she kind of feels about them in the house, or something like The Haunting of Hill House. I mean, it's all about the disintegration in a way of a person's mind. They may be coming in contact with something evil. The house may be a monster, but it's also what has happened to that person in their background that causes them to be vulnerable to that, if that makes sense. And I love the way she gets inside people's minds and kind of explains how they're prepared for, or in some way, for what they're coming up against. Or like We Have Always Lived in the Castle is a great one too, by Shirley Jackson.
Ooh,
and again, that isolation. Yeah, the isolation and disintegration. hitched to the house. And, I guess maybe I don't know, cover your ears, spoiler alert, but, Mary Cat is the murderer. And I have a lot of sympathy for her. I mean, I feel like the cousin who bursts into the house and tries to change their lives is the villain, even though nobody else in the book does. They think he's saving them. So Jackson always turns those things on their heads, because we understand why, to a certain extent, we understand why maybe Mary Cat did what she did, which I think makes her completely sympathetic in a way. So yeah, Jackson she has this like creeping kind of get under your skin, get into your brain kind of horror that I think, I don't know, it works better in some ways. And I love the new incarnation of The Haunting of Hill House, but I kind of feel like her interior stories kind of get under your skin better than seeing that those visual representations of Hill House.
Yeah. I mean, how well said. Like this, there's an atmospheric horror, an internal horror that doesn't necessarily hinge on the idea of a clear-cut villain or a clear-cut hero. This is, so to sum it up for any audience members who are just joining, by the way, Melanie, a lot of people, as soon as we brought up Shirley Jackson, are in the chat just typing Hill House in all caps. I think we've hit a vein there. This gives us a good, and I would say insightful idea on the nature of terror, the nature of horror. One of the defining characteristics that you, Andy, Lisa, Stephen agree with is the idea that there is some sort of, if not optimism, there is some sort of fervent desire for optimism. We see the horrific, and if we truly contrast it, right, if we experience the fullness of a world that these authors are building, then we also must see the good. It reminds me of the moment when the exorcist finally shows up in the novel, and there is this beautiful passage about a feeling of serenity amidst the madness. With that, I'm doing a segue. Is it working? I'm doing a segue to Q&A. Okay. All right. So thanks. I like the earnest nods here. Okay. Yeah. We're finding optimism amid my horrible moderation. So we have a lot of questions, a lot of comments. I'm going to ask Jessica Nettles, one of the people doing the real work, and Therese here doing the real work to make Broadleaf happen. I'm going to ask you all, if you can hear me, to send our audience Q&A questions. Okay, yes, yep. All right. So while we're waiting for the questions, and we just want to give space because our time is coming to a close, we want to give space to the most important part of any story, the audience that is sharing their time with us. Let's catch up. What'd you read recently that you liked?
Well, that's for us, right?
Yeah, that's
that
for you.
Okay.
Yeah. No,
I was watching the chat to see if people went.
Okay. I know. I just we're working live, Andy. But yeah. What'd you read recently that really rocked you?
I have an annual October reread tradition, which my shirt is sort of in honor of today, which is Something Wicked This Way Comes. I read that every October, and I love that book very, very much. So that's what I'm working on right now. I'm about 50 pages from the end.
Ray Bradbury. Oh, he was onto something with that. Melanie, Lisa, what are you all reading? Also, the moderators explained to me how to get the audience questions, so I'm back up to speed.
All right. Well, I'll say There's this author that I'm loving lately. Her name's Rachel Harrison. And she had a book, I don't know, maybe I read it last year, called The Return, which I loved. And she's got a new book out called Cackle. And I've just started that and I'm loving it. She writes monsters really well. So that's pertinent. So
I guess the last thing I read was Gwendolyn Case, The 8 People Who Murdered Me, the excerpt from Lucy Westenra's diary, which Lisa put me onto. And I'm actually currently reading Stephen Graham Jones' The Only Good Indians. Actually, I was out of town earlier this week and I got about halfway through it. I'm really enjoying it so far.
Awesome. That's like, so these are recommendations, folks, from the people who live and breathe this field. I would like to open the space to read some questions now that our moderators, our broadleaf producers, the hardest working producers in the business, have saved me by pointing out the Q&A. Dawn asked, where are some good places to send academic essays to for publication?
Well, I don't know. I feel like the journals that I would think of would be like, oh, let's see. I would say maybe there's a couple Gothic journals that are out there. If you look up Gothic and academic journals, those should pop up. I think the most recent one was maybe the Journal of the Gothic. There's the Irish Gothic Journal. There's the Journal of the Fantastic and the Arts. If you're writing about, say, speculative fiction and horror in relation to women, FemSpec has a journal now. And FemSpec also offers review opportunities for people to review different books coming out in the field. So those are just a few that I would throw out there.
Perfect. And let's go to this is an interesting question. I think we'll enjoy, and I think this is one that all four of us will play with here. John says horror lends itself well to novel length format. Do you see a place for horror short stories? Do you think they'll become more marketable in this age of, hot take, John, shorter attention spans, Netflix episode formats, etc? ?
I'm not sure the market's ever gone away for them. I think right now they occupy, definitely it's shifted and changed, in the heyday of the 80s, when you had people like King publishing, there were magazines that were, he published in a lot of low rent places, but he published in some good places too. But I guess right now the place for those things is anthologies and collected volumes and smaller journals. I would take an opportunity to plug the Southwest Review, which has its annual scary issue that comes out in autumn that I just guest edited, and it's full of short stories, it's full of poetry, it's got some nonfiction in it as well. So there are places that are looking at horror right now and taking stories. In terms of it being a lucrative market, I don't know. I'm not sure if attention span has all that much to do with it. I think it's more or less just, do short stories make money? Do people buy them in the way that they buy books? And I guess the answer to that's probably they don't, but I'm not an expert to really answer that. So
I think we're going to start seeing more short stories and short form horror in other forms too, like podcasts. I think you're going to see a lot more people consuming stories that way, which kind of fits because, I feel like that's where horror really got its start, was people telling stories to each other, scary stories. And I think we're going to see more horror shorts out there, especially in anthologies, as far as on film. So, there's always a space for that.
It's and completely agreed, by the way, although I do have and do have a badger in the race here. As full disclosure, I am associated with some horror podcasts. I I thought we could. I thought we could explore this one. This is a fun one. As you know, folks, if you are a fan of horror, this is the most wonderful time of the year, going toward the second best holiday of the year. The first best, if you're watching this, being your birthday specifically, the second best holiday of the year being Halloween. So Bill asked, what was your favorite Halloween costume as a kid? And does that say anything about your horror writing today? Melanie, I don't want to put you too much on the spot, but did you ever do the Halloween thing as a kid?
Oh yeah, but I don't know. It's such a blur. I don't really remember a favorite costume. I mean, I think I was a vampire one year and I was a ninja one year. I had varied tastes and interests. I don't know that my Halloween costumes influenced what I've chosen to pursue. Maybe, I don't know. I'll have to think about that a little bit more. Lisa, Andy, what Halloween costume influenced your trajectory in life?
Well, I too was a ninja and a vampire at one point. So once again, you and I are always on the same page, Mel.
Synergy, yeah.
But I think the most memorable costume I ever had as a kid was in 1989. I wore it to school, to the Halloween party when I was in the 5th grade. I went as the Joker, Jack Nicholson from Batman. And that was in the days long before the internet existed to give us these things readily when we needed them. And so my mother had to just basically make this costume, which involved finding one of my dad's old sport coats and painting it purple, and it wouldn't dye. So we had to literally hand paint a sport coat jacket purple with I think it was fabric paint. But anyway, I wore this coat all day long, and I was 10 years old, and it was a man's coat, and it was very stiff. I could barely move in it because the paint had dried. And but that's my favorite costume that I ever had as a kid. Yeah, certainly. Yeah, that's connected to like the beating heart of my love of Batman, probably. So
I was never a ninja. I was never the Joker. I was never a vampire. I should have been. Mine was and I still, like, I think about this. If I still had this costume, I would probably still be trying to wear it. It was Jem from Jem and the Holograms. It was the first time I ever got to spray that like horrible pink stuff in my hair, and I loved it. So I think anything that evokes that, like the idea that you could just like touch your earring and transform yourself and like live this fabulous life that nobody knew about is wonderful.
And that we found a pretty inspiring final question. Now, I did, to be fully transparent, I did save that question because it's kind of a fun one. We've had a conversation exploring some harrowing things, right? But you brought it back around, Lisa, when you said this idea of transformation, right? This idea that no one wakes up and says, I'm just going to be a jerk today, right? No one wakes up and says, I'm going to destroy Tokyo just because I'm a jerk, right? Godzilla is sympathetic, right? From Pennywise's perspective, excuse me, is sympathetic, is a creature doing what it was, what its biological impetus is. This, perhaps the most valuable thing, is one guy's opinion, from this panel is that we are seeing an optimism. We are seeing I think we've got some comic book fans here. We're seeing in the darkest depths, we're seeing some bright lights, and perhaps it is the darkness that defines the light that people see in the end. Now, we've recommended some excellent podcasts. We've recommended some excellent work. We have also been so fortunate to share your time. Now, audience members, Broadleaf attendees, Melanie, Andy, Lisa, and Stephen are taking time out of their day whenever you are not looking directly at these people on Zoom. They are typing the things that generations are going to read. I would like to thank you on behalf of the audience. I know there are a lot of questions. I hope that you all felt this panel was worth your time. Lisa, Andy, Melanie, I would like, as always, to leave the last words for you. Literally, the last words. So if we could do a little round robin before we end this panel, let's start with Melanie, and then we'll go to Andy, just because you're on the Zoom. From my perspective, I'm going like left to right. I'm not super creative with this. And then we'll end with you, Lisa. What would you like to see in the world of horror in the future?
Oh man, that's hard.
I know.
My
I tricked you
word.
with the costume question.
You
I know.
did. Yeah. It was like a bait and switch. I thought it was done there.
Well, horror makes
well, let's see. I'm a fan of haunted house stuff, and I've said before that I will read practically anything with a haunted house in it, but I do like it when people do new twists. So I would like people to keep experimenting with freshening up haunted house, and I would like to see this new weird movement we got going on to continue, because I really like weird and unsettling horror.
I would like to see more things like Midnight Mass. We just recently finished that, and that's like nothing I've ever seen before. And I can't really quantify why it is. I mean, it takes a very traditional trope in horror, the vampire, but it spins it in a way that's philosophical, that's spiritual, that's and it does so within a very specific tradition, but expands that to a universal connection with people and audience. And I would like to see more of that. I'd like to see more like deeply thoughtful philosophical horror. That's I think much needed by people.
I love Midnight Mass too. I'm gonna say I would love to see more female monsters, more female villains. I love the final girl. She's a staple in horror, but I think sometimes we fall into the trap of feeling like the women need to be good or moral, or I don't know. I would just love to see, a woman making really terrible bad choices and being the vehicle that's driving the horror a little bit more. So
well, that's our inside scoop on the future of horror. Fully agreed. Midnight Mass, fully agreed. Haunted houses. This is our time. We're officially at 1:01 p.m. Thank you to everyone. Broadleaf, Melanie, Andy, Lisa, Stephen, thank you as well. I think we are wrapped. Therese, if this was in person, would this be the point where you yell at me for going over time?
Oh, no yelling. You're fine. You're good. It's lunchtime though.
Yes. Yeah. Guys, it's great to meet you. Thank you so much. We're talking out of school now. I know I did a lot of word salad, but I do know that you are working writers. And thank you for taking your time today to get away from the keyboard for a second. I say, as though we don't all have keyboards right here.